Welcome to the Advisor Club podcast, hosted by Paul Hewitt and Steve Rumsey from Optimus Advisory Group. On this podcast, we discuss ideas to transform your clients into your advocates through better human understanding and connection, and through improved financial and economic acumen.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us on the Advisor Club podcast. I'm your host, Paul Hewitt, president of Optimus Advisory Group, and I'm joined as always by our Chief Investment Officer, Steve Rumsey. How you doing today, Steve?
Great. Ready for another podcast.
Awesome. Today, we are going to discuss how to be a super communicator. So not just a communicator, but a super communicator, how you can strengthen those relationships with your clients, give you some techniques that you can use so that your clients can become advocates for you and for your practice. So to begin with, one of the things we want to talk about is types of questions that you want to ask with clients so that you can become a super communicator, so that you can get into those deep, meaningful conversations with them. So rather than, you have a client come in, and rather than asking them sort of your normal fact-finding type questions, what do you do for work? How many kids do you have? That kind of thing. You want to ask questions that get them to think, get them to actually give you a longer answer. So, for example, what does your job mean to you? Or what do you love about your job? What do you love about your wife? Those types of questions are going to get them to talk in a more detailed manner, get them to open up in a much different way than they would if you just ask them sort of those bullet point fact-finding type questions. When was the last time you cried? If you're talking to somebody and you want to get them to really get deep into their feelings.
Well, it reminds me, I wanted to test this out. So I was at a dinner event, and a gentleman I've known for many years, a friend, he was talking about his new baby, and he was just all lit up, couldn't wait to tell me all about his new son that was born. And I thought, you know what, I'm going to give this a shot. So I said, we were talking about he was recently remarried. And I said, so what stood out about your wife? What attracted you to your wife? Well, he just lit up and he was like, oh, she's beautiful and she's so smart and kind. And I knew that he had been married before. So I took it a different step. I thought maybe I shouldn't ask this, but it worked out all right. I said, well, what attracted you to your first wife? And he was fine talking about it. He said, oh, she was beautiful and she just was gorgeous knockout and all this stuff, but she had all these other issues. But he was more than happy to talk about it. And I think we made a very deep connection because I could tell by the look on his face that he was surprised we'd even had this kind of conversation at this level at a dinner with other people talking around the table.
Right.
And he seemed thrilled that we were even spending time talking about him.
Right. And, frankly, right, most people like to talk about themselves. And if you give them a good excuse, a good reason to dive into maybe their family situation or their career, things that they've done in the past, they're more than willing to open up and talk about that. And again, it provides you, as the advisor, provides you with more information about this person and different ways that you may be able to connect with them, things you have in common with them. I was reminded of this story I heard of an oncologist in New York, and he dealt a lot with patients that had prostate cancer. That was kind of his wheelhouse. And prostate cancer is a very slow growing cancer. And so typically, the scenario for this doctor is he would have a patient come in, they get tested, and they realize that yes, he does have prostate cancer. So he would bring the patient into his office, sit him down, and immediately launch into, hey, look, you've got prostate cancer. Here's the two options we have. Okay, we can perform surgery. However, surgery is risky, and there's nerve endings near the prostate gland that affect urination. They affect sexual function. And so, chances are that those will be impacted if we perform surgery. And surgery, of course, just in general carries, a certain amount of risk. The second option is really the better option because prostate cancer is so slow growing that we can just monitor it. And, we'll do periodic blood tests. If, we see your PSA levels increasing and we see the tumor growing, we can do MRIs and eventually perform surgery if that's necessary. But the chances are that it won't be necessary. You'll end up passing away of old age as opposed to prostate cancer. So he would, tell the patient, why don't you think about it overnight, sleep on it, and then come back, tomorrow and let me know what you want to do. So to the doctor, it seemed pretty obvious, what the right course of action would be. The non-surgical option was very successful and, didn't carry the risks that the surgery did. So he would assume that the patient would come in the next day and tell him, yeah, I want the non-surgical operation or non-surgical choice because, who wants to get cut on, right? Who wants to undergo surgery? What happened though surprised him is inevitably most patients would come back the next day and said, you got to cut me open. I want surgery. And he couldn't quite understand why that would be because, the evidence was pretty clear as to what the right choice would be. And he started sort of self-reflecting on his approach, how he articulated the options to his patients. And he realized, maybe it's me. Maybe I'm not communicating well. And so what he did is he made a change in how he talked to his patients when they came in. So the next time a patient came in that was diagnosed with cancer, when they came in, instead of launching into the choices that the doctor was going to provide him in terms of what sort of treatment to do going forward, he asked the patient, what does this cancer diagnosis mean to you? Well, that gave the patient a chance to talk and to open up and to talk about their family, their wife, their kids, maybe an experience that they'd had with a relative with cancer, things that they'd heard about it, whatever it might be. And that gave the doctor a much better chance to relate to the patient, to find ways that find things that they had in common. And once they got through that conversation and made those connections, he then presented the options to the patient. What he found the results were when the patient came back the next day is they wanted to go with the doctor's preferred method, which was to just monitor the prostate cancer going forward and do the non-surgical approach. So again, his method of communication changed and that changed the outcome. And he was able to guide patients to the best option for them going forward. But it was only possible due to his change in approach and how he communicated. So when you're having a discussion with someone, they really fall into three categories. When you have a client that comes in, sometimes they come in the door, right, to meet you and they just slap down on the table their retirement plan and they say, I need to roll this over. What do I do? Right. But that's not the typical conversation. That's kind of a fix it conversation. Like, hey, I've got this problem. Please fix it for me. That's not typically what happens, right? Typically, when a client comes in, there's kind of this building rapport time where, you get into a longer conversation about them, about their family, about their goals and aspirations. And those conversations can be either emotional conversations where you're sort of feeling it, or they can just be social conversations where perhaps, you've got an existing client that comes in and they just want to, talk about family and talk about things that they've been doing, the vacations they've been on and so forth. When it comes to those practical conversations, I don't know, Steve, do you have any input on how you handle those?
So it reminds me about when my wife and I were first married. We went to a marriage conference at our church, and the pastor was a great communicator. And this really stuck out to me. He said, husbands, if your wife had a really bad day or some drama with a friend or whatever, family member and she starts to vent what's happened and they said this and this and this and this. The last thing you want to do is try to fix the situation. So that's the practical conversation. She's not looking for a practical conversation. She's looking for empathy. She wants you to hear her out and be on an emotional level with her. And you'll be making a big mistake if you try to fix it. And I know men, we have this tendency to try to fix things as if we're hearing somebody and saying, okay, you want a solution. Okay, give me all the facts. Okay, yeah, I got a solution for you. That's not how you handle that. So you need to know what kind of conversation is warranted for that particular time.
Right. And especially if you're talking about, let's say, your spouse, or even again, even a prospective client that walks in the door, if you're immediately fixing the problem, they might take it as, oh, you're telling me I did something wrong. You're telling me I wasn't smart enough to know the right way to do it. They don't necessarily have the reaction that you're anticipating, right? They could take your help in a negative way, and again, it could draw out that negative emotion. So it's definitely something you have to be careful with. It's not the most common type of conversation you're going to have immediately with a client. Maybe at some point, after you've gotten into a deep discussion with them, you'll get into the fix it part, but to have that be something that comes up right away, again, that's not likely. The other thing, as we talked about, there's these emotional conversations, right? So oftentimes, the reason somebody is coming in to see you in your office is they've had a big event happen. Maybe that was retirement, maybe that was the birth of a child, maybe that was a spouse that passed away, right? And for you to ignore that event and not really dive into what it means to that client of yours, you're really missing a huge opportunity to build that relationship, to get, to kind of take things from, let's say, the shallow end of the pool down to the deep end of the pool where you can really get into their emotions and their feelings, things that they value, things that they believe in, their experiences and so forth, and really make that emotional connection with the client. And then finally, you'll have existing clients that come in. Maybe they're coming in for an annual checkup or semi-annual checkup with you. A lot of times, right, they want to spend a decent amount of the appointment time, decent amount of the meeting time, just talking about life, right? Connecting with them. And that's gonna make them want to continue to have that relationship with you. If there's no emotional connection, then, they're gonna maybe leave you at some point, right? It's not there's nothing keeping them there. I'm reminded of, like, if you go see a doctor, right? And, if you go back to a doctor annually, a lot of times it feels kind of cold when you go in, almost like it's the first appointment again. I had an experience recently. I saw a doctor, and then less than 3 months later, I was seeing him again, and it felt just like the first appointment. It didn't feel like there was any connection, like he remembered anything about me or about the situation or about anything that was going on. He was asking me the same questions he was asking me when I first went in to see him. So there is no connection. It feels like, oh, I could leave and go see another doctor because he'll ask me those same questions too. So there's nothing keeping me there, nothing drawing me back to that doctor.
Yeah, and you remember the saying that I always am reminded of is in a bear market, people fire their brokers, they don't fire their friends. And if you're not spending quality time, Zoom calls, in person, however you communicate with your clients these days, when times get rough, and like Paul said, if you're have a robotic relationship with these people and if you're just a problem solver, well, a lot of people can do that. So you need to have that emotional connection with people. And I'm reminded I have a client he's been a client for 25 years, I think, and his wife passed away a few years ago. And I've noticed now every time there's a hiccup in the market, he'll call, but his sequence is let's talk about the hiccup in the market. So we'll talk about that for 5 minutes. And then he just wants to socialize on the phone. So we'll talk about his golf game, his kids, politics, whatever, and we'll talk on the phone for 45 minutes. But when I used to pick up the phone and he said, "What do we do about these markets? What's happening?" I thought, "Oh man, I got to try to talk him down." But really, it's just the way we do it. It's just our way of doing it. He just wants some reassurance. He's fine. He watches a lot of other commentators and everything. He just really wants to talk.
Yeah. I mean, and if you're in a situation where you're a widow, uh, you're missing a lot of social interaction, social connections. So
Oh
you
yeah.
you may, I mean, you need that, right? He's probably lonely to some extent. The other thing that you mentioned is sort of being self-aware and picking up on the tendencies of your client, right? You really want to what we call it's called neural entrainment, which is to sort of sync up with your client, match their rhythm, match their pace, match their cadence. And if they have a particular way that they feel comfortable, right, with the phone calls, with the personal meetings, they like to cover certain topics first and then move into other things. If you can match that, they're going to feel a lot more comfortable, right? They're going to feel like they've got a lot more in common with you because you guys can sync up, right? It's kind of like, you're hitting a tennis ball back and forth, right? You're just rallying and it's a nice good pace and that's the kind of person that they're going to be drawn to. The other thing that I think helps with that is authenticity, right? You got to open up and share parts of you, parts of your family, parts of your experience with your clients, and they really appreciate that. They feel the authenticity. There was a study done about people listening to laughter on a recording to determine whether that laughter was fake or whether that laughter was real. And people were very good at choosing correctly in terms of picking out the fake laughter versus the authentic laughter. In some experiments, it's as high as 95% accuracy with that. So your authenticity, that's a secret weapon for you, right? That's something you need to use. You need to open up and share with clients so that they feel that deep connection.
And along those lines, what it reminded me of what you're talking about earlier. I like what Simon Sinek says. And this is all about being self-aware, really. It's really about stopping, taking a breath, and thinking about what's happening in the conversation. So what he's done when he's learned these tools is he'll be in a conversation and he immediately is going to the solution. I'm going to offer a solution. That's what they want. And then he'll even stop in the conversation and say, well, hold on a minute. Are you wanting me to listen to this and give you a solution? Or you want me to just listen and connect? No, I don't want a solution. We can do that later. Okay, okay. So he's actually stopping himself because he's made the mistake time and time again to say, the only reason they're telling me this story is they want me to give them a solution. I'm a solution guy.
Right.
And he stopped himself and said, well, wait a minute. And this is key for when we were talking about with marriages. You better not jump into the solution mindset if they want the emotional connection.
Yeah. Is this a fix it or is it a feel it?
Yeah. And with men, I hate to keep beating us up, but we're notorious for not being on that emotional level. But it reminded me of this story. I had a friend for 15 years and we were talking about our marriages and everything. And he was kind of sharing this concept with me at the time. He's like, Steve, you've got to get into the deep part of the pool. We were talking about that. Don't stay in the shallow end. You need to get into the deep part of the pool, even if it's uncomfortable. Because at one point in his own marriage, he said his wife sat him down and said, look, I don't feel you're ever connecting with me on an emotional level. And I need that from you. You seem to be all in your head, heart's detached, and I have to make that connection with you. And he said, I don't think I can do that. She said, if you can't do that, we're probably headed for divorce. And that made a huge impact on me thinking about how vitally important that is for women, especially, but for humans in general. We need that emotional connection. I was like, I think my jaw dropped when he said that conversation, I thought, that's where the rubber meets the road right there.
Right. And with your clients, is a client going to ask you that question
No.
like your wife would or your spouse would? No, they're not going to ask you that question. They may think that, right? That may be in their head, that may be on their mind, but they're not going to give you the opportunity necessarily to figure this out, right? So again, getting into those deep conversations, asking questions about values, beliefs, experiences, figuring out which type of discussion you're involved in, right? Is this a fix it, is a practical conversation? Is it a feel it, emotional conversation? Is this just a social conversation, right? You need to be able to be self-aware and to understand that. Try to get again, the rhythm matching the pace, the cadence, kind of sync up with your clients, if you will, and be authentic, right? That's very, very crucial to being a super communicator. Well, I think that's it for this episode of the Advisor Club podcast. Stay tuned for more. Bye for now.
Thank you for listening to the Advisor Club podcast. Click the subscribe button below to be notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Optimus Advisory Group. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is for financial professionals only and is not intended to be a substitute for professional investing advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding investing.